Despite the many challenges of closed international borders and lockdowns, one of the greatest privileges of the last year and a half here at the Perth US Asia Center has been able to reach out and via virtual means, such as this video, have conversations with key people in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly those in our Indo-Pacific network. Many of you will recall, the Perth US Asia Center has been appointing every year Indo-Pacific fellows who are based in the region, in Japan, in Korea, Indonesia, India, and in this case in Singapore, to help us understand what's happening on the ground when we're not able to be there ourselves. One of the great benefits of having Indo-Pacific fellows is their own analysis, which we are fortunate to be able to sharing on the Perth US Asia Center website. Today, I'm delighted to be joined for a foreign policy conversation with one of our 2021 Indo-Pacific fellows, Professor Kaewkamol Pitakdumrongkit. I practiced that 3 times and I got it wrong anyway. Dr. Dumrongkit is at the Rajaratnam School for International Studies, widely known as RSIS, at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. She's the deputy head and a professor at the Center for Multilateralism Studies. And she has just published one of our Indo-Pacific analysis briefs for the Perth US Asia Center. Is up on our website now, focusing on towards a shared economic recovery, ASEAN's role in driving post-COVID regional integration. Kaewkamol, it's wonderful to see you, virtually though it be, and thank you so much for the wonderful analysis you provided for us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me as an Indo-Pacific fellow. I'm very honored to be part of your program.
Now, we're also very happy to have you in Singapore. We used to refer to Singapore as Perth's northern suburb, or more accurately, Perth is Singapore's southern suburb, because it used to be easy to get back and forth. I think there were 5 or 6 flights every single day to Singapore. Today, it's a little bit more difficult, but we hope once again we'll be able to entice you to come down here to Western Australia and join us in person.
Great. Happy to. Thank you.
Now, look, at the moment, it's a little bit difficult to think post-COVID, which means it's the perfect time to be thinking about post-COVID. And when we think about economic recovery, when we think about the economic challenges that have set many of the countries in the Indo-Pacific back significantly because of lockdowns, because of difficulties with trade, because of the sheer human cost of disease, and that we tend to think about governments and organizations that are designed to help us kind of work through these problems. And so we're really fortunate to have your paper. Again, the paper is part of our Indo-Pacific Analysis Brief series. The title, again, if I go over it, is Towards Shared Economic Recovery, ASEAN's Role in Driving Post-COVID Regional Integration. And at its core, pre-COVID or post-COVID, ASEAN has fundamentally been about driving economic integration. It's its core mother. And so having you in Singapore, really the hub for thinking about ASEAN, is really helpful for us. Can we start at the very beginning, where we are today, of looking at pandemic mitigation? Because obviously there has been very different experiences initially, say in Vietnam or in Singapore itself or in Indonesia. Could you talk to us a little bit about ASEAN's role thus far in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, sure. I think as we know that the first COVID-19 case that was found outside China was found in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. It was found in Thailand in the middle of January last year. And as we know, the virus quickly spread throughout the region. So by the 3rd week of March 2020, all ASEAN countries reported at least 1 case. Right? And ASEAN, as an international organization, was quick to respond to the crisis. So among the organization's initial responses was the Special ASEAN Summit on COVID-19, which was held in the middle of April last year. So this is significant because it marks the first time that all ASEAN heads of state met formally to discuss the crisis as well as ways to collectively address it. And the meeting also called a declaration calling for a region-wide approach to responding to the effects of the pandemic as well as future outbreaks. Also, the leaders pledged to collaborate on public health and supply chain connectivity. Well, there are other initial response as well. If you look at June last year, there was another summit, a regular one, is the 31st ASEAN Summit, which endorsed the Hanoi Action Plan on strengthening ASEAN economic cooperation and supply chain connectivity in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this text actually outlines how ASEAN members could jointly lessen adverse consequences of the pandemic. So, and they list out several areas of cooperation. So one is about custom clearance of essential goods. So there are plans to speed up the clearances of food, medicine, and medical equipment so that these items could flow better within ASEAN to respond to the pandemic. Another area is trade. And so the members promised to refrain from imposing additional non-tariff barriers that could further hinder supply chain disruption. Yeah, so in addition to that, this summit also approved ASEAN's leader vision statement on a cohesive and responsive ASEAN. This envisages the crafting of the organization post-pandemic recovery plan. So this plan is aimed at ensuring stability and resilience of the regional economy, as well as preserving supply chain while staying vigilant of a new wave of infection. So these are some initial response of ASEAN.
Yeah. Well, I want to get into several of the specific things you mentioned. They're very interesting. The only thing I would note is that often it's tempting to look at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, as a unitary whole, when the reality is the different experiences of countries within ASEAN are very, very different. We are very familiar here with how difficult the situation is currently in Indonesia and has been for the last several months. Last year, Vietnam seemed to be doing very well, although right now it's with the Delta variant suffering quite a lot. And where you are right now, Singapore, had also been considered to be kind of an early example. Just from a parochial interest here in Australia, we kind of had hopes that after New Zealand, maybe Singapore would be the first country where we had an open travel bubble, would be able to travel again too. But those plans seems to be off at the present time because Singapore is taking a different approach. Again, I realize you're not a COVID specialist, but can you tell us a little bit more about the situation in Singapore today?
Well, the cases are going down in Singapore and the vaccination rate, as you know, we hit about 75 plus fully vaccinated in the population. So yeah, as you know, there's some uneven recovery among different ASEAN members, and that remains a challenge for the region to recover from this pandemic.
Well, going back to that, the diversity within the region, you talked about a comprehensive recovery framework that ASEAN has been putting forward together. Could you help us understand a little bit more about what is in that, particularly for multilateral cooperation? What is ASEAN doing under this comprehensive recovery framework?
Sure. So the full name is actually ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. So this is, as you know, it's a multilateral framework. It serves as the organization consolidate community-wide exit strategy from the pandemic. So what it does, it outlines responses that member states have to undertake as the region go through different stages of recovery. It also helps because it's a multilateral collaboration, multilateral framework. So it also functions as a reference point so that various stakeholders could work together and foster policy coordination among them. And so this is the ultimate goal, is to ensure that the region would achieve a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. And if you look into the detail, this recovery framework consists of 5 broad strategies, which represent 5 priority areas. So the strategy 1 is about augmenting health system. So this is to ensure that the region has resilience and sustainability in the public health area. The focus is on beefing up essential health services and vaccine security, as well as boosting capacity of healthcare workers. The strategy number 2 is enriching human security. This strategy seeks to protect people and community in the recovery process and beyond. So there are plans to gear up ASEAN population with digital skill and education, the reskilling and upskilling that we have heard about many times, right? So that the population can participate in the future workforce in the new normal. And also this strategy takes into account gender equality as well, because as we know, women tend to suffer more than men in this crisis, right? For example, they account for about 70% of the frontline workers. Many of them lose their job because many of them take part-time jobs, which have higher risks of layoffs than full-time workers. And many of them become victims of domestic violence and abuses. So under this strategy, there are programs to help women in these vulnerable groups as well. And then moving on to strategy 3. Strategy 3 is about maximizing the potential of intra-ASEAN and broader economic integration. So the COVID-19, as we know, has caused a lot of economic damages, right? So if you look at this region, last year, the combined GDP of all 10 ASEAN members shrank by 3.3%. And the FDI inflows into the region declined by 1/3 or by 33%. So that's huge, right? So we lost the opportunity for investment. So going forward, this region needs more, not less, international trade and investment for its successful recovery. So that's why this strategy strives to intensify not only intra-ASEAN trade and investment, but also broader economic cooperation or economic integration between ASEAN and non-ASEAN countries. Moving on to strategy 4 is about revving up inclusive digital transformation. So this strategy takes into account the increased role of digitalization in helping ASEAN countries bounce back from the pandemic. So that's why there's a plan to promote e-commerce, digital economy, and digital connectivity, as well as advancing digital legal framework and institutional capacity. And last but not least, strategy 5 is propelling the region's resilience and sustainability. So ASEAN wants this recovery to be a durable and long-lasting one. So there are programs to help member states achieve sustainability in all dimensions, ranging from investment to energy to green infrastructure. So these are the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its components.
Well, comprehensive is a wonderful way to phrase that, because those 5 points really do encompass almost everything. Can I ask a slightly impertinent question? And that is kind of, is it real? If you're looking at this from, say, the perspective of Laos or Malaysia or even Singapore, Thailand, Singapore, when these countries are dealing with COVID today, has this pandemic caused them to look more towards ASEAN so that this 5-point comprehensive plan is more meaningful, or has it caused them to look externally to other parties kind of for assistance? What's the broader trend on that?
Well, the broader trend is that I think they have to look at ASEAN more, because the comprehensive framework is actually actually emphasized that ASEAN would have to work together, because if we work separately, we're not going to achieve a successful regional collaboration, because all ASEAN countries, all ASEAN economies are intertwined. So if you look at the data, ASEAN trade more with other ASEAN countries, right? So the incentive is there just to leverage on this comprehensive recovery framework to recover together as a region.
Well, that's actually encouraging news. I saw something a couple of months ago somebody had written that said, watching science fiction movies and television has taught me that if an external space alien attacks Earth, all of humanity will unite together to defeat the alien. It says, these most recent COVID-19 pandemic has taught me that if the whole globe is threatened by, a virus, that half of humanity will side with the virus. Now, that obviously has a lot more to do with politics in the United States than it does in ASEAN. And I think maybe the ASEAN way that you're talking about of kind of looking to band together and working together on these problems offers a better hope for where we might be going on that front. Let's move on. Let's talk about supply chains. You mentioned it in your opening comments as well. I recall over a decade ago when the horrific tsunami, earthquake, and disaster, the triple disaster hit Japan, there was a lot of concern about disrupted supply chains. But it turns out that the real disruption to supply chains took place just later on that year in your homeland with the tremendous flooding in Bangkok. So we've now had a decade to start thinking about risk associated with supply chain concentration. Obviously, we are now facing a very different threat to supply chains with international travel being disrupted, with everything to that. Can you tell us a little bit more about what ASEAN is doing to ensure relatively robust supply chains to avoid disruptions to supply chains, which are so important, as you mentioned, to all the economies within ASEAN?
Sure. There are several initiatives that ASEAN is carrying out to ensure the security of supply chain. So one example is the comprehensive recovery framework that I mentioned earlier. Well, there are other initiatives as well. I think you mentioned the international travel, right? Yes, ASEAN has one framework that it's aimed at restoring international travel. It is called the Declaration on an ASEAN Travel Corridor Arrangement Framework, or ATCFA in short. So this was endorsed last year, in November last year at 37 ASEAN Summit. So this initiative is about movement of people. And as we know, supply chain is not only about movement of goods and services, right? We need to have free flows of labor or workers in order to sustain supply chain. So this ATCFA is actually doing that. So its main goal is to set up a region-wide essential business travel scheme so that this could facilitate intra-ASEAN business trips while upholding public health safety. Yes, so people, but some people tend to say that, well, this travel corridor framework is very narrow. It's only about business people and only about work travels, right? But I just want to mention that ASEAN made clear that there is a plan to expand this framework to cover other types of trips as well, such as international tourism or leisure travel. Yes. So this framework faces a lot of critics. So one group of critics would say that, well, we don't need a region-wide initiatives because I think, as you mentioned earlier, there's a bilateral bilateral travel bubbles are being the deals about bilateral travel bubbles was being concocted in these days, right? So maybe there's no need for a region-wide rule because, well, why we need a regional framework? Why country can set up bilateral bubbles, right? Travel bubbles, right? But I would like to say that having several bilateral deals like this can lead to another problem, which is the problem of incompatibility of rules and regulations, right? When you have a lot of bilateral travel bubbles, then rules about custom clearance or rules about immigration may clash with one another. So that's why we really need a multilateral mechanism like this travel corridor framework, because what the multilateral scheme could do away with the incompatibility of rule and regulations. So, and there are other initiatives as well. As you know, we have ASEAN has ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC, and ASEAN country also sign on to RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And I can talk more about that if you like.
Well, I would like, and you provided a perfect segue, at least to start talking about RCEP. really from its very inception, one of the things that ASEAN has done well has been the harmonization of standards and norms and processes and laws that kind of facilitate more of a multilateral or regional approach. And the way you describe travel could be extrapolated to many other sectors of the economy as well, right? There are advantages to bilateral bubbles, but there's also some disadvantages when you've got a lot of different rules for a lot of different countries like you've got with ASEAN. So let's talk about how that mandate for multilateralism, if you will, has been applied to trade. We here in Australia have paid a lot of attention to a broader, comprehensive and progressive agreement of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but with less public profile, there's been another pathway towards integrated trade in this region, in the Indo-Pacific, and that is the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, or RCEP. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of where RCEP stands, and then more importantly, what role do you think regional free trade agreements like RCEP might play in a post-COVID recovery?
Sure. RCEP is actually a free trade agreement that ASEAN did with its 5 dialogue partners, right, which are China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And at this time right now, RCEP is actually the world's biggest FTA, right? So if you look at the number, if you combine 15 RCEP economies together, you're going to get a market of 2.3 billion people. And if you combine these 15 economies GDP together, it would figure around 26 trillion US dollar. So the potential is there. But as you mentioned earlier, yes, RCEP is actually heavily criticized because people tend to compare it with CPTPP, another free trade agreement that Australia is also the party to. Right? So CPTPP is, as we know, is often dubbed as the 21st century trade deals with WTO plus elements, right? So it's WTO plus here means that rules can go beyond what is agreed at WTO, right? For example, CPTPP has chapters on labor standard and environmental standards, right? So it's kind of like a very advanced agreement. But RCEP, to be honest, RCEP doesn't as advanced as CPTPP. But I just want to make my point that RCEP is actually right now is the ASEAN's most comprehensive FTA. So if you compare RCEP with the other ASEAN plus one FTA, RCEP has more chapters touching on new issues that ASEAN hasn't done before. For example, RCEP has chapters on competition policy, government procurement, intellectual property, and e-commerce. And also another good thing about RCEP is that is in its rule of origin, or ROO, which allow companies to produce made in RCEP goods. And this is helpful for fostering or deepening a regional supply chain. Okay, maybe just I'll walk you through some details a little bit so you can understand fully about what the ROO mean. So if you look closely into the detail, RCEP requires 40% regional value content. So what does it mean? So it means that for the final product to be sold duty-free in this trading block, it must have at least 40% of its value-added components sourced from RCEP members. Right? For example, let's say I am a shampoo producer. I can source at the minimum 40% of the ingredients into my shampoo in terms of value added from 15 RCEP economies. And then I can sell the final product, which is the shampoo, tariff-free in this trading block. Right? Yeah. But when we talk about this ROO, some people tend to say that, well, 40% ROO is very low. I mean, in terms of FTA standard, because it makes them doubt whether firms really is gonna really benefit from this very low threshold, right? But I'd like to say that why this ROO is 40% is relatively low as compared to other FTA. But this threshold, this low threshold, is great from the resilient perspective, right? For example, let me go back to my shampoo example. I can source up to 40% of the ingredient from RCEP member, right? That would mean that I can source other ingredients. I have a lot of room to play with the remaining 60%. I can gather other ingredients from non-RCEP parties to make up the remaining 60%, right? So that means that for 60%, I can, have suppliers in the US, right? I can diversify my supply chain to US, or I can diversify it to Europe, right? I have suppliers in Europe, or I can do that with Middle Eastern country. I can do that with Latin American countries, right? It's actually helps firms as well as countries to diversify their production networks and increase their economic resilience. So that would be my take on RCEP.
Oh, fantastic. And I appreciate the detail in your explanation. I recall that you had previously worked with RSIS in doing these World Trade Organization parliamentary workshops in Singapore. And more directly to my last question, that you were also involved with the framing of the ASEAN Economic Community. And so I wonder if you'd help us explain that. Just like you've explained RCEP very well, I don't think a lot of people here have paid enough attention to what's happening with the ASEAN Economic Community itself, the blueprint that's out there for that. But obviously, given what we've already been discussing about a post-pandemic recovery, the vision that's been laid out for that community is going to be a key element of that.
Yes, sure. I can talk more about ASEAN Economic Community. Maybe just to brief some brief backgrounders here. So AEC is ASEAN Economic Community Building Project. So the organization envisages that by the year 2025, the regional economy would possess 5 characteristics. So 1, highly integrated and cohesive economy. 2, competitive, innovative, and dynamic ASEAN. 3, enhanced connectivity and sectoral cooperation. 4, resilient, inclusive, people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN. And 5, global ASEAN. So in order to achieve these characteristics, ASEAN coined AEC Blueprint 2025, which I also help with my colleagues at RSS to make some recommendation to shape up this blueprint. So this blueprint actually contains measures, specific measures that to be undertaken by ASEAN member states. And this document lasts for 10 years. So starting from 2016 to 2025. So if you look at this period, 10 years, so the midway is the year 2020, right? So that's why last year, ASEAN conducted what we call the midterm review. So the midterm review, what is it, right? Is it actually an exercise done in the midway of AEC implementation, just to check the implementation progress? So just to check, okay, we are midway through, what's the progress so far? What are things that we have to do next in the next 5 years? But this also serves as an opportunity for the organization itself to identify challenges or emerging challenges that have to be addressed in order to successfully accomplish AEC in 2025, right? And just back to about COVID-19, right? What does COVID-19 pandemic has to do with this, the AEC implementation going forward? So it actually played a big role because the year that ASEAN did its midterm review, the world had COVID-19 pandemic, right? So to no one's surprise, the pandemic actually pressed ASEAN to rethink its strategy to integrate the implications of this crisis into its AEC implementation going forward. Yeah. But if you look into the detail, the recommendations that is offered by this midterm review can be clustered under 3 themes. One is addressing overarching elements and cross-cutting issues. 2 is bolstering ASEAN centrality and resilience. And 3 is ensuring inclusive and sustainable integration. So maybe I'll go through each theme quickly. So just to show you how COVID has shaped these themes. So the first theme is about addressing cross-cutting issues, right? As COVID unfolded, we know that healthcare issues are very closely intertwined with the economic ones, right? So that's why this midterm review urges ASEAN policymakers to pay more attention to how different issues are linked, as well as work together to find proper solution to address them. So strategy two, theme two is about resilience. So this concept, the concept of resilience, came up as part of the recommendations because COVID-19 triggers a realization that we need to have a regional economy that can effectively weather through future crises and bounce back from them, right? So the concept of resilience get merged into AEC implementation going forward now. Also, the last theme, theme number 3, is about inclusivity and sustainability. So these concepts get more emphasized in this midterm review because COVID-19 makes us think seriously about how to advance AEC in a way that is not only sustainable, but it has to be inclusive as well. So all people in all walks of life could really benefit from this community building, economic community building project. Yep. So this is how the pandemic play out and shape AEC going forward.
Kaewkamol, I should have this conversation every week because I need to be cheered up. With what's going on in Afghanistan, with the broader trend towards the deterioration, if you will, about multilateralism, it seems to me that you're pretty bullish on ASEAN. You're pretty bullish on the continued integration and cooperation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes, I'm rooting for AEC and ASEAN all the way.
Well, we're very much rooting for you and your continued analysis on this front. It's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with Dr. Kaewkamol Pitakdumrongkit, who is an Indo-Pacific Fellow here for the Perth US Asia Center. And again, if you go to the Perth US Asia Center website, you will find a link to her most recent Indo-Pacific analysis brief for the Perth US Asia Center called Towards Shared Economic Recovery, ASEAN's Role in Driving Post-COVID Regional Integration. Kaewkamol, thank you again. And I look forward once again to the time we might entice you to visit Singapore's southern suburb here in Perth. And thanks for the conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.